Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Welcome to part 2 of this series. Gil and I just released 2 weeks ago, you'll have gotten it, a podcast about how to communicate with women. It's really focused on advice for men or for anyone else who's in a relationship with women. And this podcast that we're about to share is about how to communicate with men. It's about advice for women or for anybody else who is communicating with men. And as I alluded to a moment ago with mentioning Gil, I have here the delightful Gil, my favorite husband of all time, who is also just a really insightful person about relationships and communication in general. I'm really excited to share this because I don't want anyone to think that the men have to just take action or make changes or integrate new ideas. I think the women do too. So before we jump into it, I do want to give the caveats, which I shared at the beginning of the previous episode as well, which are, we're going to make some generalizations in this episode about men in general and women in general and how they in general operate in heterosexual relationships. And oh my gosh, generalizations will always be generalizations and there will always be exceptions. And we are going to make these generalizations based on our own experience of being in a heterosexual relationship and based on my experience, obviously, coaching many others. And obviously, a generalization will never capture the full complexity of the human experience. There will be many exceptions. Obviously, we're talking in general, as I said, about heterosexual relationships here, which are not all relationships. So I hope you'll forgive us if we say something which doesn't resonate or feels untrue in a way which, I don't know, annoys you or upsets you, and take all of this from a perspective of us really just trying to be of service and share some ideas that will hopefully help people. I say that because I feel like sometimes making gender or heteronormative generalizations can be upsetting to people sometimes in this cultural moment. So I just want to have said all my things up front. Yeah.
I make no apologies.
Gil makes no apologies. Gil thinks I'm being a little excessive. Okay. So let's share our points. Do you want me to go first or do you want to go first this time?
Oh, you can go first.
Okay. So we're going to alternate sharing a couple points of each prep. So my first point that I wanted to share, again, for advice for women or others about how to communicate with men. My first piece of advice for the women is that I would highly recommend, if something is important, to communicate very clearly and explicitly in a moment when they can really receive it, that it is important. So I want to be really specific here. If something really matters to you, like you're like, okay, I really want you to be planning dates for us. This really matters. I'm thinking about this because I was talking to a girlfriend of mine about this some time ago. And she was like, I mentioned to him that I really wanted him to be planning dates for us. And he just hasn't. And I'm just like waiting for him to do it. And I sometimes sort of like mention it, but he still hasn't done it and I don't know what to do. And it turned out that she was mentioning it. It wasn't like she hadn't communicated that to him, but she would sort of say it offhandedly and sort of in this kind of like jokey way that they have, or kind of like sassy, jokey way that they have. So it wasn't that she'd never mentioned it, but he wasn't really receiving it because obviously in a relationship, we make many requests of the other person, and hopefully most of the requests are followed, but obviously not all of them are. And we all kind of have this understanding that certain things might slip through the cracks. And she had never sort of sat down with him in a moment when he was calm, not in the middle of doing anything, not just coming or going from something, looked him in the eye and said, hey, this is actually really important. And I'm not assuming that you were trying to upset me by not doing it, but I think maybe you're not realizing how much this matters to me and why it matters to me. It really matters to me because it makes me feel, when you plan dates for me, it makes me feel like you really value our relationship and our future together. When you don't, it makes me feel like maybe you don't really value our relationship. And so I suggested that she did that. She really take the time to explain that to him, and she did. And then he started planning dates on a regular basis. So my point of this is to say there's a difference between just mentioning it And maybe you've even mentioned it many times. And if it's really important to you, finding a moment when he can really hear you and explaining to him in a very serious, genuine way, looking him in the eyes, sitting down, that this matters to you.
Yeah. I'm realizing now that this overlaps like 90% with my topic. So let me just mention my topic
Yeah,
and then
please.
I'll respond
Yeah.
to what you said because I totally agree. Yeah, my sort of tip was or principle for ladies is he wants to help you but needs you to explain how. And so let me respond to what you said
Yeah.
first. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of requests that people can make of each other, and they have varying levels of, urgency or prioritization. And I know it's very tempting sometimes to be mad at your partner because you think this is obvious. Why doesn't he get this? But like, it really may not be obvious. And so, and for example, I don't know, maybe in the example you used, someone could say, "Oh, I really like to try different types of food. So it'd be great to have date nights so we could try different types of food." And he may hear that as, "Oh, well, I can just like get takeout and then we'll try different types of food," right? He may not understand. And I would even say sometimes the person making the request may not fully understand why it is that they're making that request.
Yes.
So I think it's really important for you to not just make a request very clearly and in a way and time that the person can hear it, as Katie just said, but like to understand why you're making that request. Because maybe at the heart of it is just like, I want more of a feeling of romance in our lives, or I want a feeling that you're taking care of me sometimes and it's not just me, or I just want the feeling that like you care or that you value me. And I know that this is the other reason why you should explain or at least understand the why, even if you don't explain it. He may be thinking that he has a better idea than you on how to do something. I'm like, "Oh, you want to feel valued? Well, I mean, I'm going to start mowing the lawn every Saturday and you'll have a beautiful mowed lawn every Saturday." Because he may have his own idea about how to make you feel valued. And it's like, look, no, I already know how to feel valued. And it's by you doing this specific thing that I'm asking. So this is just to reinforce what you said, Katie, which is really explain why you want something and what's underlying it. And it could be just like, "Oh, I'd like you to do this because it's stressful to do all these other things at home," right? Like we've had that before, right?
Yeah.
You said you'd like me to start always taking out the dishes from the dishwasher because you were dealing with a lot of kids' logistics, school appointments, doctors' things, and, always doing the dishwasher became one of several things that like we traded off, or not that we traded off, that you asked me to start doing that maybe in the past would have been done by whoever happened to be around or whoever happened to be in the kitchen when the dishwasher stopped. Or maybe just it defaulted to you because you work from home and I don't work from home. So it just made more sense for you to do it. So you talked about, "Hey, can you do this thing and a couple of other things so that I feel like I don't have to like feel resentful about taking on some of the like school logistics." So that was really important. It wasn't just like, because you could have come to me and just said, "Hey, can you please just be the one to do the dishes?" And I could be like, "Yeah, I guess. Yeah, all right." And then just it doesn't happen for a while because I didn't understand there was all this other stuff underneath it, which had to do with you feeling overwhelmed by tasks and chores and needing to feel like taking things off your plate so that you feel, better. But you had to have like a pretty like explicit conversation, like logistical conversation and emotional conversation with me about that. And that was helpful.
Yeah, I love that because I think, and I think that's a great push too. Like even before you have the conversation with a male partner, you could get really clear in your mind about why this matters to you. What is the emotional reason, or maybe there's an intellectual or some other reason underneath it, so you can really communicate that to them. And I love your point, Gil, about how you guys might end up both having a conversation about what is the best way to meet your needs, because maybe maybe you came to them saying, can you please take out the trash, or can you please plan dates? And they're like, but what if I mowed the lawn so you felt really taken care of? And they might be like, yeah, no, thank you. Or they might be like, that would be amazing. I would love to feel cared
Do
for.
both, or yeah.
Or I don't even care about dates. Please mow the lawn. I'm just saying anything could happen.
Right.
But until you can have that conversation about what are the underlying reasons why you want this, you'll never
Mhm.
know. Or you gave this great example when we were prepping for this podcast. You were like, you could totally imagine a situation where, say, the male partner is supposed to take out the trash every night.
Mhm.
But he's been working really late.
Every week, yeah.
Every week. But he's been like, working really late. He's been working so hard on this big deal at work that's going to make $50,000 extra for his family this year. And he's going to take them on this amazing vacation. And he's like, oh yeah, sometimes I'm not doing the trash, but like, I'm just working so hard for my family because I want to take them on this amazing trip. But like, it could be that the female partner is like, I mean, yeah, that's nice. Like, I'm excited for this vacation. But like, what I really want is to feel like my partner's here in the day to day.
Yeah.
And the way you show that to me is by taking out the trash. So it's like, yeah, first of all, communicating what you value, but then also, like, again, why it's so important.
Right. And I mean, another way of looking at that trip thing is like a trip will begin and end. And right, yeah, okay, we had this amazing vacation to Fiji because you closed this deal you've been working on for so long. But like now the trip's over and now I'm back to just feeling unsupported. So like, and there could also be a subtle thing where some type of men, especially if they're high earners or they're just maybe temperamentally this way, they kind of want to like gift their way out of everything. They want to respond to everything with a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And like, again, there could be some relationships, we mentioned this in the last podcast, where, yeah, maybe that's what their relationship is. It's kind of a quid pro quo and,
they don't have to take out the trash.
Yeah.
Or
Or they don't have to really listen to your feelings that much. And she's not going to complain too much about how much he works. And like, that's okay if that's what you want. But if that's not what you want, these conversations are really important so that he understands that actually what you value is the feeling that he's there and he's supporting you, as opposed to you just nagging him. Because I'm sure everybody knows nagging is like the worst way to communicate a need to a guy. It just makes him feel really put off and just like attacked.
Well, and do you want to describe, I think as a woman, I sometimes feel like almost emotionally triggered by this concept of nagging. Like, I don't want anyone to tell me I'm nagging. I'm just trying to like get you to do the thing I need you to do. Like, how would you define nagging versus explicitly communicating in this way that we're talking about?
Well, I think nagging, it's a set of circumstances. I think nagging happens when someone is constantly a lady is constantly telling her guy the same thing over and over, like making the same complaint. And he, for some reason, is not understanding it, or he feels that he addressed her concern and she's still bothering him about it. So to me, at its core, it's a miscommunication, right?
Mm-hmm.
The female partner is not feeling heard or listened to or supported. And so she's resentful now, and she's trying to get her needs met in an unskillful way, which is basically just saying the same thing over and over in a complaining, resentful way. And again, he either feels that he's already addressed it and that she has no more justification for saying the same thing over and over. Like she might say, "Oh, you never do anything for me." Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, "What are you talking about? I just changed the oil in your car. I just washed it. I just painted the house. I just took the kids to school." Right. Clearly she's feeling that, right? Nagging comes from an emotional place of like not feeling supported. And so the minute you get into nagging on one side and like logical justification on the other side, there's a huge miscommunication right there. So yeah, that's why what we're talking about, which is having that sit down, and then going back a little bit to the first podcast about talking to women, embracing the emotional vortex. Clearly, your wife is nagging because she's upset. She's not feeling heard. She's not feeling supported. Now, it doesn't mean that she's necessarily right in the sense that you need to do something different.
Yeah.
But it does mean she's not feeling listened to. So at the very least, you're not really understanding what her complaint is.
Ooh, this is so good. I wish we could go back to the man conversation. We're not going to do it, but to add like underlying every nag is something worth looking at.
Yeah, it's a miscommunication at heart. Well, and the miscommunication could be that her understanding of his obligations, whether they're logistical obligations or emotional obligations, is different than his.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So again, I feel like literally every argument, no matter how big or small, has like a less than 0% chance of leading to like a breakup or a divorce, right?
Yeah.
Because in theory, her feeling like he's not supporting her could lead to a conversation or a series of conversations where he's just like, well, I just don't want to do all that for you.
Yeah.
And in his mind, hopefully he doesn't say it, in his mind, he may be thinking, because you know what? I'm not that into you anyway, you know, and
Yeah.
I'm done with this, right?
Yeah.
And I would say that's good. Because now, if that happens, then he actually doesn't value you, and you were right, and you can't make him value you by nagging him. And now that you have that conversation, and there's a breakup or something, and I'm kind of treading over this very lightly, or rather, I'm passing through this very lightly. Obviously,
This is a serious thing. Yeah.
breaking up or a divorce is a very serious thing. But the point being that you have to take things to sort of a theoretical extreme conclusion to really understand the implications of it. Some women who nag all the time may be unconsciously just feeling like they're not valued, and they may not be valued. And not just because the guy could be better at communication or could be more attentive, but maybe he doesn't value her, and like she needs to kick him to the curb. So that's the problem. And I think people do intuitively often know that these little things have much bigger swords underneath. And sometimes that's why they're afraid to get into them.
Because they are indicative of deeper problems, right? Like a nag could be, you know, the male partner could be like, oh, you're always nagging me about taking out the trash, right? We keep talking about taking out the trash. You're great at taking out the trash.
Well, it could be that simple, yeah.
Right. But the nagging could come from the fact that she doesn't trust that he's actually going to take out the trash.
Yeah.
Right.
Or that he doesn't listen to her.
So she keeps reminding him.
Right.
And so, but if they had that actual sit down discussion and she was like, look, you know, I keep telling you to take out the trash because like, you don't take out the trash. So what's going to happen here? And I do feel frustrated about this, you know?
Yeah.
It's a more direct conversation versus.
And if he says like, well, you know, sometimes I just forget, like, you know, that's valid. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they haven't lived in that house that long. I mean, if you've been married 10 years and he forgets to take out the trash, there's a deeper problem there. But maybe you recently moved and he hasn't really ingrained the new trash night in his mind yet because it's a new schedule, because you're living on a different street, whatever. Okay. That happens to me sometimes. Like, it just takes me a while to build a new habit and I do forget. But like, if I would love to know what a guy who never takes out the trash says to that, right? Is he just still forgetting? Or maybe also this speaks to like, he's a person who's unreliable in general. And maybe that's the real problem, is not about the trash, but about the fact that she doesn't trust him to like take care of his life. And if she doesn't trust him to take care of his life, how can she trust him to like be a co-partner in their relationship?
Oh man, this is where it gets very... Okay,
we're kind of stepping into a couple of the other points.
Yeah, we'll leave it. Okay,
yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say? Because I know this was sort of your point too. Before we move on,
well, what was the point here? He wants to help you, but needs you to explain how. Yeah, so we went a little bit past this, but to like get back to it, it's basically really try to understand what it is that you're asking and why. Because if you explain it very explicitly and very directly, that's incredibly helpful, because it's not his fault if he's not necessarily getting it, because you may not have communicated it in a skillful way.
Love it. Okay. My second point was, it's okay to tell him what you like communication wise in a very explicit way.
Yeah. And that also taps into some of the stuff we said, but yeah.
Well, and I'm saying something a little bit different about this, but like, it's okay to tell him what you like explicitly communication wise. I'm not talking about like, you know, it's okay to tell him that you want him to take out the trash, which I feel like is what we were saying, or, you know, make explicit requests, which is, I feel like, what we were just saying. Actually, here I'm talking about it's okay to make explicit requests for what you like in terms of actual communication.
Okay.
Which is related to just being direct. But the metaphor that I like to give here is around like sex. Like, I feel like the common advice that you now hear in like women's magazines, for example, which is so great, is like, don't expect him to read your mind. Like, tell him what you like. Like, if it's a little more to the left, like, tell him a little more to the left, or like a little higher or harder or whatever the thing. Like, tell him explicitly. And I think the same, Gil's like smiling. I think the same thing applies to communication in relationships, but sort of ironically, because even though it's less taboo, people I find are less comfortable doing that. Like, I think in my experience, when I coach women, I will say to them things like, oh, well, could you say to your partner, like, hey, it would really help me if you could like repeat back to me what you just heard, just because it would make me feel like you really heard me. And I would sort of know for sure that you heard me. And it would really help me if you could like repeat it back to me and then say something about like what that must be like for me. Like, you repeat it back and you're like, oh, man, that must be so hard because you're feeling really nervous about XYZ. Like, you can be that explicit in terms of your requests. Or like, I'm feeling just so down right now. Like, I'd love to hear that, like, I don't know, you still love me, or like how you're feeling about me. Like, you can make requests that explicit. And I think often I have found my clients are like, wait, we can be that explicit with our partners. We can just tell them like exactly what we like. And I'm like, yeah, you totally can. And obviously there's an art to this. Like, you don't want to say it from a place of, I don't know, like anger or forcing them or being pushy, but from a place of, again, just like you would in sex, being like, this is what helps me feel really good in this conversation, would be if you did these conversational techniques. I think that can be just really powerful and really helpful. And partners are often really grateful for like some guidance about this.
Yeah, no, totally. It overlaps a little bit with the whole like, don't expect people to read minds. Men can't read minds and women can't read minds. In fact, I often have that issue actually with you, Katie, where I sort of expect you to read my mind. So that may even be less of a gendered issue. Yeah. And just, I don't know if this fits perfectly into this bullet point or if it kind of applies generally, but one thing I really advise women not to do is don't make demands, make requests.
Mm-hmm.
But this can be a very subtle difference because the difference could be in the tone of voice or the words that are used. But like when men feel like they're backed against a corner and they're being told what to do, it's very off-putting. It puts them on the defensive. It gets their, defenses up. And if he does do something, he may do it just to like shut you up, or he may do it because he just wants to like not have this discussion, but he'll be resentful after. And that's like poison.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to introduce that into the relationship. And frankly, if he's doing something just because you demanded it, that is definitely not a good foundation for the relationship. Now, sometimes, and I'll get into this in a little bit, it is, I think, appropriate to have very clear boundaries where you're not demanding something, but you're saying, this is a non-negotiable boundary that I have, and I need you to do this in order to meet this need. And this assumes, by the way, when you've gotten to this point, that he's already agreed in principle that it's justified and possible to meet that need that you have, but maybe he's struggling again, either with remembering, like he said, he was going to stop leaving his clothes on the floor, but that's what he's used to doing. And I think it's absolutely very critical not to make him feel like you're giving him orders, because sorry, but it's just like an energetic thing. Men don't like to be told what to do.
Well, no one does. I don't think women like it either.
Yeah, sure. I just think I could be assuming, and it may not be true, that there's a certain energetic feel to like telling someone what to do that really, really puts off men, whether it's other men doing it or women doing it.
I don't think anyone likes it, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, but the reason I bring that up also is because sometimes making a very strong and explicit request could be interpreted by the man that way. And you're just making it very clear, like, okay, honey, you've already agreed with me that you want to help me more around the house. You've told me that it is important that I feel supported. And you told me that you admitted that you weren't chipping in enough. By your own admission, you said you weren't doing enough. Okay, so given that, do you agree that you will never put your clothes on the floor and always put it in the hamper? And do you agree that we're going to do this other thing that you said you'd do to help out? And then if he says yes, then the next time he doesn't do that, I think it's totally appropriate to say, you're not meeting your commitments. And we have to hash this out now. Like, we have to talk about it.
Okay, I'm just going to pause because I think you're getting to your next point about boundaries, which I am here for.
A little bit, sorry.
And I am totally here for it. I just want to make sure I fully explain my point first before we do that, because I wasn't actually talking again. Like, I think we're mixing two things a little bit. We had talked initially about how it's really important to be really explicit about like what you want, like whether it's picking your clothes up off the floor or taking out the trash or like planning a date night, whatever. It's great. The point I was making specifically here was it's good to tell people what you want communication wise. Like,
Yeah,
I
sorry, I did
want,
get off topic a little bit. So,
it's okay.
yeah,
I just
sorry,
want to make
finish
sure
your thought
everyone
then.
listening understood my point.
Yeah.
Just because if you were confused, maybe everyone else was confused too. Like, I think there's a real art to like, even in the conversation to saying, here's what I want you to do listening wise. I want you to like affirm that it's reasonable for me to feel this way, you know? And we had a whole conversation before about how you know, sometimes I think probably anyone, but especially men, I think can feel sort of like, you know, I believe what I believe, you know, because you like are like, you might feel like, oh, well, you need to be more assertive in the workplace or something. If like maybe your girlfriend is like feeling upset about someone who's, you know, upsetting her at work, you know, and it's like, well, she really wants you to like just take her perspective, not say, you know, change what you believe, just sort of like suspend that for a moment. You don't have to stop believing what you believe, but just sort of take her side. So the point I was just trying to make is it's okay to ask in quite explicit terms for what you want them to do. You can literally say things like, hey, can you just like repeat this back to me? Which is something that I do to you in our relationship because I just like, it helps me to feel heard. So I just want to make sure I've said that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, because I did get off topic a little bit. And part of the reason is that, you know, on the topic of like asking for things, like I said, sometimes the asking explicitly can be mistranslated by the man as like a demand, or like you said, you might say, I really just need to know that you're on my side. And, you know, we've literally had this happen in conversations with us where I hear that as I need you to agree with me, or I need you to say you believe something that you don't believe, which men find it very hard to like something that doesn't feel logically true to them, right?
We've literally, over the course of our relationships, had like actual arguments about this where like I was telling Gil some feelings that I had, and I was like, and maybe he like didn't totally agree with my interpretation of events or perspective. It was about something outside of our relationship. And I would be like very emotional. I'd be like, I need you to take my side. And he was like, well, I just believe what I believe. Like, you can't make me change my mind. Like, I can't lie to you about how I feel. And I was like, I just need you. I would just say over and over, like, I need you to be on my side. And he would like, that particular phrase just has like never landed with you. Even to this day, I think doesn't totally land with you. You've always felt like it sort of implies like suspending what you believe about a situation and you don't like it.
Yeah, I think, like I said, what it is it taking someone's side means to me, and I think this is a question of semantics.
Yeah.
Taking someone's side, when I hear that, I think, oh, I have to agree with you, or I have to believe in your interpretation of events. Whereas like I might be listening to you telling me something that's upsetting to you, and you might have interpreted those events in a particular way, and I might be thinking, oh, I think she interpreted that wrong. I don't think that's what happened, right? And so taking your side for you, I think just means empathize with how you're feeling and empathize with how you might be seeing things. But I'm hearing it as you have to believe my interpretation of events. You have to agree with me, right? And so there's like some subtle stuff there. And then it feels like you're demanding that I think something that I don't think. And that's sort of what set that off.
Yeah. And there was a whole trigger for you about like, you know, I believe what I believe. I'm not going to like just suspend what I believe in order to like, you know, be in this conversation with you. And we had to eventually I had to figure out how to communicate what I wanted explicitly in a way that you could hear. And eventually like words like, I just want you to like see it from my perspective and let me know that you see it from my perspective.
Right.
That ended up feeling better because it wasn't like you had to stop.
Because I can take your perspective and see it and understand it without necessarily changing whatever I'm believing.
Right. You might continue to believe that I have behaved incorrectly or you would have behaved differently. And again, just as we had this conversation at the beginning of this podcast, like that happens both ways, right? Like I might be listening to you and feel like, well, you know, Gil did this thing. And like, honestly, if it were me, I wouldn't have done it or been upset in this way.
Right.
But, you know, there he is. But it doesn't really do anyone any good for me to be like, well, honey, I think you did the wrong thing. You know, it's better for me to just take your perspective and be empathetic to what that perspective is.
Yeah, because in the end, what everybody wants is just to like feel like they're being heard, right? And
totally.
So that they can sort of get their feelings out. And usually after they're out, things can be a little bit calmer and, you know, one or both people might take a different perspective, in fact.
Yeah. So anyway, this is this is just a reminder, because this episode is for women or for other people who are in relationship with men, that it is okay to sort of say, hey, here's what would be really helpful for me. And just like, perhaps you might in a sexual context, do it from a perspective of not that you have to do this, but like, it would make me feel really good and it would be really helpful to us. And would you please be willing to try this? And, and that it might take some, just like with sex, like experimentation to figure out what works, right? Like, you didn't like it when I said, you need to take my side. That wasn't something that worked for our relationship. We had to find other words that would work.
Right.
And that's totally going to happen. Okay, so I'm done with that, and you can move on to your next point, which was also good.
Yeah, well, and I just want to quickly acknowledge that what you just said also ties into the first points we made on this episode, which is basically men want to help you. Men who are in a relationship generally want to be of service and they want to help, but they may need your help to understand how to be helpful, right?
Right. This was just like all of my points tend to be very specific. It's like a very specific subpoint, which is just like literally when it comes to the nuts and bolts of how you guys are communicating, what words you're saying, how you're listening. It's okay to make specific requests.
Yeah. In fact, you probably have to. Otherwise, you're going to keep miscommunicating. Yeah.
And we've done a lot of that. Like I've said, when you say that, that's not very helpful. Or could you please try this? And, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, sort of then if you take a step further down that continuum is my other point, which is my other sort of bullet point principle, which is establish when necessary, and it's not always necessary to go this extreme, but establish clear and inviolable boundaries. Meaning, I do think I'm a big believer that like, if you go far enough with this sort of exploration of feelings and having these discussions and hashing things out, you're going to hit some stumbling blocks, some rocks on the way that seem particularly like, rooted in the ground and like hard to get out of the way. And they generate a lot of emotions. And all that means is that they require extra special care and attention. And I think one of the things that it would behoove them to do is to have stronger boundaries around what is acceptable to them or not. And, getting back to what I said earlier, not in a sense that you're like, no, you must do this. Like I demand you do this. And this is going to sound kind of contradictory because on one hand, I'm saying it is good to watch your tone because just based on impact alone, even if you feel justified in like saying things in a particular way, just be aware that saying it in that way will like put him on the defensive. But I think it is really good to have boundaries, clear boundaries over certain things where your needs just continually aren't being met. And I think this also ties into nagging. So I guess I'm using this example because on the internet, I see a lot of this, like women complaining about their men leaving clothes on the floor, which by the way, I don't understand. The hamper's right there. Just put it in the hamper.
Yeah.
So I don't even sympathize with men who just refuse to use the hamper. I don't know how big of a problem this is. It's just sort of a common trope online. Let's say you're feeling like, oh, I'm nagging him now. I'm constantly having to ask him to not put his clothes on the floor. Now, assuming that he's not a brute and that this is just a bad habit he picked up when he was younger, because maybe his mother would pick up his clothes, or maybe he just used to live with a bunch of roommates and they were pigs, and this is just something he hasn't sort of outgrown. And so assuming that he does care about your well-being and cares about the house feeling neat and nice, and that it's just sort of a habit, it may take him a little while to change that habit. But if he's consistently just not giving a shit, like that requires some serious looking at, because and again, let's say you've had one of these emotional vortex type conversations, you're really upset because he left the clothes on the floor again. He was sort of trying to avoid the conversation, but like he embraced the vortex. He talked about it. He had a 1 hour long discussion and you said, yeah, these are the reasons why, it's aside just from having the house be messy. It makes me feel like you're not a partner in keeping this house as like a nice, harmonious place to live. It makes me feel like, even if it's something that doesn't bother you at all, it does bother me. And because it requires so little effort to do this thing that makes me feel better, I don't understand why you wouldn't do it. So let's say you have this whole conversation and in principle, he agrees. He says, you know what? clothes on the floor don't bother me whatsoever. I don't get why they bother you, but it does bother you. And the effort required for me to change my habit so that I stop doing this thing that doesn't that will make you feel better is very minimal. So I'll tell you what, yeah, I'm going to go do that. And so he's agreed with you. You're not demanding something that he considers unreasonable or unjustified. He's agreed with you. Yeah, I'm willing to do this thing for you because it makes you happy. No problem. But then he still doesn't do it. I think it's totally okay to make some kind of radical boundary like, hey, remember the conversation we had yesterday? You did it again. And, and maybe it was innocent. Maybe he forgot and it's taking him a while, but you need to say, can you go pick it up right now? Now, this is very tricky because it's going to sound like a demand. In one way, you could say it is a demand, but I would also say you're just reminding him that this is what he agreed to, and he's now reneging on his commitments, right? Explain it to him in a respectful but clear way. Like, you said you would do it and you didn't do it, and now I'm feeling unsupported again, right? Also, men have a real sense of honor. If you remind a man that he committed to something and then he didn't follow through, that does kind of reach him in a way that nagging might not get to him. But this is just a silly example to say this. If you've had the conversations and he's agreed with you and he's still not following through on his commitments, either he doesn't truly value you, and that could lead to some very hard conversations about your relationship, or maybe he does value you, but maybe he's overwhelmed. Maybe he hasn't been honest enough with you about the struggles he's going through.
Yeah,
right?
He doesn't have capacity.
So again, I know that sometimes, because I believe a lot in responsibility, and sometimes the way I talk almost makes it seem like everything's on the men and they have to fix everything. Mm-hmm. It's just because you can only control what you do, right? So as a guy, I think about the things I can control. Mm-hmm. So if you've had this, I don't think the solution is, well, this makes me feel shitty when he doesn't do this, but I'm just going to live with it. I say, no, don't do that. Don't live with it. Don't let that boundary go. Keep the boundary, but just know that the conversation isn't finished, even if he thought it was finished. And instead of nagging him, just be like, after dinner tonight, I need to have a conversation for as long as it takes about what's going on here, because I feel like you agreed with me. I feel like you made a commitment, but you still didn't do it. So maybe I'm missing something. What's going on with you that you're not able to follow this simple thing that you already agreed to? And it could be, that could be a growth opportunity for him, where he's like, there's all this stuff going on that I haven't even been telling you about at work, or I'm worried about my parents because they're sick. And it could be that he was trying to be helpful. And by the way, that's like a good sign. He's totally overwhelmed and he was trying to make a commitment to you to help you, even though really the best thing for him to do would have been to just say, you know what, actually, I know you're upset about this and I want to help you on it, but here's what's going on with me. I'm totally overwhelmed and I don't know how to deal with it. So this is all a long way of saying that if you bring things up that are not acceptable to you and you have a clear boundary that you do not allow to be violated, except if there's a good reason, like maybe there's a more urgent issue on the horizon, it will actually help him, because sometimes men need to be given a very firm boundary to allow them to get clear, right? Either he needs to get clear that this is not acceptable behavior and he's being weak, and he's not going to like that feeling and he's going to want to change, or he'll hit a boundary where he's just like, I can't do this. I can't deal with this relationship issue right now because I've got these other things going on. And that may be an opportunity where you say, you know what? Let's forget about the clothes on the floor. Let's talk. Let's see what's going on with you, because I think maybe you've got more going on and we need to talk. So it's like an opportunity for growth and connection,
I love this. I love this nuance. So I want to say to everyone listening, when Gil told me that this was one of his points for this podcast, he was like, women have to have strong, inviolable boundaries. I was like, Gil, this is really serious. This could lead to the dissolution of some relationships, or you're putting down these really strong barriers.
But selectively.
Totally get it. And I appreciate the nuance you're giving about sometimes they really can't honor that boundary for all kinds of reasons, and we need to be sensitive to that. But it was so interesting because as we were talking about it, you were like, but Katie, you do that to me. And you gave this example of the recent thing with impetigo medicine.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it's okay
Mhm.
for me to
Yeah.
tell this example. So one of our sons has impetigo, which if you don't have toddlers recently is sort of like it's a
It's a skin
bacteria. It's a
rash.
skin rash. You basically
There's
end up with these like small red bumps on your skin, and there can be more or less, and you put this cream on them to sort of make it go away. But one of our sons just
and you have
has.
to be very regular about it because they'll come back. The bacteria grows back like really quickly.
Yeah. And it seems to go away quickly for some people, but for our son in particular, it just is sort of like chronic and we'll get it managed and then it'll come back. And for our son in particular, this is for our son who is nonverbal. And like, if he gets a bunch of impetigo, his speech therapist won't let him come to speech therapy. And that, we're still hoping he'll learn how to talk. And the speech therapy is very important for other kinds of communication as well, like signing or other things. So like, it can really upset me when his impetigo gets bad because then he can't go to speech therapy. And
Mm-hmm.
in our relationship, it had basically always been just that I was the only one who ever put his impetigo medicine on him. And he needs it in the morning right before school, and he needs it at night right before bed. And there are certain things in our relationship that, each of us do more of. And so there are certain things, obviously, that I do more of, maybe because I'm home during the day and my schedule is flexible. But this particular item, it always seemed to me either of us could do because it was always when we were both there because Gil takes the kids to school. So he's there right before they go to school and Gil's there at bedtime too. So it always seemed to me that either of us could do it, but I was the only one who ever remembered to do it. And then sometimes you would just sort of like complain about his impetigo being back. Like, I can't believe it's back. This is so bad. And so at some point I just got like really annoyed because I was just like, why am I the only one who remembers this? Like, blah, blah. And I got annoyed. And we had one of those like, sit down, face to face, calm over dinner conversations where I was like, look, Gil, this is really important to me. I really need you to remember the impetigo medicine. And you were like, you know what? That's fair. I talked about why it mattered to me.
Yeah.
You're like, fair. Got it. And then a week passed and impetigo medicine application by Gil was non-optimal. Like,
yeah, just to add a little bit of nuance here, it's not that I was refusing to do it.
Yeah.
It's just that we both do the kids getting up in the morning and putting them down to bed. And so you would always just remember before I did.
No.
And potentially sometimes I just forgot completely.
No, because then you pointed out, because sometimes I was just doing it and you were like, Katie, I would have remembered if you hadn't jumped in.
Yeah.
So then I wasn't jumping in. But then basically I would just sit there at bedtime or in the morning and I'd be like, don't forget, like to myself. But I'd also be like, but also don't say anything, because Gil has to remember. And then 50% of the time, at least, you wouldn't do it.
I had at least a 50% hit rate.
Okay, fine. But I was then but it was very tiring because I both didn't want to jump in before you were going to do it.
Yeah.
But then I also didn't want to forget because, again, if he has these outbreaks, if we're not super careful, then he can't go to speech therapy and there are all these downstream implications that are really upset me. So I was like, I got very upset after the course of a week where I was just like, no, you said you would do this. We had the calm conversation. Like you didn't. And there was like one dinner where like I was pretty fired up with you about like, you said you would do this. I have been patient. I've given you a week. I have not jumped in. Like, and you're not getting it done. Yeah. And I was like pretty upset. And I'm not usually that upset with you. In fairness, you're usually super good about doing things I ask you to do. But I was pretty fired up and irritated about the impetigo medicine. And so I think I was like, it's interesting. I'm just sharing this example because I feel like you were like, ladies need to set firm boundaries. And I was like, I don't know. Like, not that I'm against firm boundaries, but it felt like a more extreme statement to me. And then you giving me that example reminded me like, I guess I did do that. I started with the more clear communication. But then like when I felt fired up, like I also, again, I didn't share it at a random moment. Like when we were passing each other in the hall, like, how dare you with the impetigo medicine? I, again, actually sat down, but then I just like was angry with you, looking you straight in the eye about like, hey, this is not okay,
And I think that was good. And here's another thing that.
And I want to say you were very good about the impetigo medicine after that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't want to go on too long of a side digression about this, but I think there's often a dynamic where women either are at home more, or they have part-time jobs, or they have flexible jobs, and men tend to work more out of the house.
Not all. Lots of people with,
I didn't say all.
Okay.
I said there can be these discussions. The point being that often women can be just like, I don't understand why he doesn't just like, isn't more on top of these things. And I think one thing that can definitely happen is like, for example, because either you or our nanny takes them to therapy, I'm it's not even ingrained in my memory where I'm not even aware that the therapist won't let him go there
We
with a
had
type.
talked
No,
about it,
hang
though.
on, hang on. This is. I think you're trying to get ahead of the point that I want to make.
Okay.
The point that I'm trying to make is whether I forgot, whether I didn't know, whatever. I don't have the same hyper awareness of all these little routines and the consequences. So one of the things that needed to happen is we needed to have a few of these discussions where you got angry because like it's just there's something about remembering things that there is like an urgency element to it.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I just never emotionally understood the urgency until I heard it many times. Like, this is the issue. This is the reason why. And then something about that triggered my memory to like start remembering more. So that's the only point that I'm trying to make is like assume good intentions, because that's actually something you and I discussed yesterday or this morning, which is one of the benefits of having the like putting out small fires and having these discussions is that you have goodwill. And when you have goodwill, you assume good intentions, right?
That was my last point. So maybe I'll share that now.
Yeah, go
Just
ahead.
like whenever possible, especially in your communication, explicitly assume good intentions and make a distinction between the impact that it had versus the intentions. Like, I think people are always so much more, and this is again, any gender. We just happen to be talking about women communicating with men right now, but it can be very helpful to like assume, hey, I'm just going to assume that you meant absolutely nothing by it, by, never being the one to put the impetigo medicine on, but like in that you had no bad intentions. You were just sort of like, oh, the medicine gets put on him every night. Perfect. It gets done. But like the impact it had on me was that I feel kind of unsupported and like I'm alone in this like parenting task that we're supposed to do. And it's all on me, even though it has like fairly serious implications for some other elements of our son's life. So like, I think on average, it strikes me that women, as we talked about, are a little more like sensitive and attuned to things being off. So that I think on average, because of that, we talked about that in our previous episode, they tend to maybe make more requests in a relationship.
Yeah.
And
True.
so if you're the one making more requests, if you can make a distinction between, I'm not assuming you had any bad intentions. And in fact, I'm going to explicitly assume out loud to you that your intentions were good.
Yeah.
But it had this impact that I don't love and probably you don't love that it's having either. That's just like somebody's always going to be much more open to feedback that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I could go to my last point, but did you have any more to say on that?
No, I don't.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah, my last point is you can't ask him to meet your needs if you don't know yourself and your needs.
This one's so good.
We've covered this a little bit already, but you can't do any of these things that we're talking about if you don't have a good sense of who you are and what you need, because you're going to be, if you don't have a good sense of who you are, you're more likely to take your cues from people around you, from society, from your family, as to what is okay or not okay or acceptable or not acceptable. I think also this pertains to just what people expect of relationships or marriages in general. I think actually, if I had to guess, more women's bars are too low than are too high. It's very trendy among some circles online to say, oh, women want everything and they're unreasonable. I actually don't think that's true. I think, like anybody, I mean, women can sometimes have the wrong, they have the bar too high, maybe for the wrong variables. Like, I'm just making this up. This is probably not that common, but like, oh, I will only date somebody who went to an Ivy League school, or how come this guy doesn't have a master's? That's weird. I don't know if he's that smart, like silly variables that may or may not actually mean anything. That's not to say you shouldn't have a bar that you want a very intelligent person to date or marry. That's fine. But like, be thoughtful about these things, and because some things you can, and it's not even lowering the bar. It's just like being more open to different versions of what you might be looking for. But you should never lower the bar on just these deep things that really matter, which you can only know if you know yourself. Like, and I'm going to use kind of a silly example, but lately in like the online media, there's a whole thing about polyamory now. I guess there's a book about it. And even though I think this is a very tiny percentage of the population now, there's all this talk of like, oh, polyamory. Maybe this is like the answer and this and that. It's very clear to me that all of this is mostly being driven by like husbands who want to sleep around because the vast majority of women do not want to be, in these types of relationships.
Some do, but
I said the vast majority.
Yeah.
I didn't say all of them.
Yeah.
Right. I'm comfortable with generalizing. And I think that's just sort of a sillier example, but I think there's a lot of examples where women just like kind of tone down very real and deep needs, like the need to be heard, the need to be listened to, the need to whatever, I don't know, feel safe, whatever it is. And these are usually very deep primal core needs. They've kind of learned to tone it down because they've been told it's like too much or it's not, reasonable or whatever it is. This advice is much better for people who aren't yet married, because it probably really sucks to be married and you've done a lot of work and you've put in a lot of effort and just to kind of realize you're with the person who just wants a fundamentally different type of marriage where, they don't want to do all that work, right?
Yeah.
They just want to like do their life projects. And they want someone to be home to be comfortable with and have sex with and have some company occasionally, but they don't want to put in all that work. And I would even say that that's an okay type of relationship or marriage to have, but it may not be what you want. And if it's not what you want, like, don't convince yourself of that, really have a higher expectation for yourself. I especially want like people who aren't married yet to really heed that warning, because I think so many people right out of the gate are just like, oh, well, men don't really like women who have tons of feelings or whatever. So I'm just going to tamp it all down. And so in the dating process, when they should be vetting for this kind of thing, they're actually not allowing their potential partner know that this is important to them. In which case, either he can say, oh, no, I'm totally on board. That's the kind of relationship I want to have. Or they can say, you know what, this is not for me. And then you can move on and find the right person.
Right. You can only show you. No, that's 100% true, but there are many ways in which you can't show your true self to others unless you can see your true self yourself.
Yeah. Yes.
So part of this process of communicating effectively with men is knowing yourself really profoundly. So you could even, not that people can never pick up some part of you that you can't see about yourself. That can be a beautiful part of relationships too.
And you could get lucky, right? You could get very lucky and just have someone who like really tries to understand you and bring out the best in you and all that. But you don't want to rely on luck. I just think I can't emphasize that enough, because I think it's much more common for women to set the bar too low than too high about the really important things.
Yes. Amen. Yeah.
I'm spent.
We just did 2 podcasts in a row, team. I hope you enjoyed them. I hope these podcasts were helpful. I hope I hope they were of service. If you want us to talk about relationships more, if you have any specific questions, send them in. I could see a world in which we do like a Q&A at some point in the future on this. I hope these were of service from both of our perspectives and however you are in relationships. I know we're talking about a lot of big questions. Hope they give you some support on that journey.
Yeah. And just on a final note, if you have a good guy who does all these things very well and he's a very committed partner, just let him play as much video games as he wants. Which probably you feel inclined to do because he's a good guy and he deserves it. But, being 43 years old and having a wife who really doesn't criticize me or judge me for playing video games while staying on top of life responsibilities, that's a lot of goodwill in the bank.
Oh, man, I have earned so much goodwill for that one. It's really astonishing.
Yeah. You got to take the low-hanging fruit.
Well, I'll take it. All every day of the week.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, everybody, we are rooting for you. We're sending you so many good vibes. And until the next podcast.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katieseaver.com. I'd love to meet you.